Good Thursday morning to you. On Tuesday, I talked a little bit about creation, the significance of how God creates the fruit with seeds in it on the third day, and Jesus is raised from the dead on the third day. There's a cool correlation, a detail that's not meant to go unnoticed. Today, I want to focus our time on redemption. We use that word a lot, to be redeemed to Christ, and sometimes I worry that we really don't know the fullness of what that means for you and for me. We think of it in a microcosm way, a theoretical way, that when we confess our sins, we are redeemed by the one who died for us, rose, and forgives all our sins. But in the accounts after Jesus is raised from the dead, there's a very specific one that I love to preach on that has details about what it really truly means to be redeemed. The tangible redemption that you and I experience every day in our life. It comes from the Gospel of John in the 21st chapter. Jesus has shown himself to the women. He's stood among them in the locked room. He's shown himself to the disciples and then to Thomas, who doubted. And it would seem in all of that excitement and all of that joy, and remember, these occurrences happen over the course of 40 days, they decide to go fishing. Do you ever have those moments? Do you have those moments where things are like really awesome, or things are not so awesome but really heavy, or you're just stressed out and you need to just get away? In the Gospels, in the Bible, they went fishing. I like to drive to the coast. If you find me at the coast, it's probably because I'm wrestling through something, or it's just a beautiful day, or quite frankly, I love the coast. But maybe you're like that. Maybe you need a moment sometimes to escape and to run away. That's what the disciples did. They returned to what they knew. They went to what was common to them, what was life-giving and really life-supporting. If you remember, Peter had his own little enterprise of fishing. And so after Jesus shows himself, we read that Simon Peter, Thomas called the twin, Nathaniel, and the sons of Zebedee, that's James and John, they all decide to go fishing. Jesus meets them. He meets them on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He calls out to them. You might recall the story in chapter 21 that they weren't having much success, and so Jesus tells them to throw down their nets on the other side, and the fish become so abundant that the nets begin to break. And Peter immediately recognizes Jesus and jumps out of the boat. And I think the thing we love to read, the detail that we love to read in the story, is that Peter's naked. He jumps out of the boat because when you've been fishing all night and it's the first daylight, you're just hot and sweaty, and apparently you fish naked. And then they come to the shore. As Peter comes and connects with Jesus, the others bring in the boat with all the fish. They're left to do the work. And in verse 15 of chapter 21, this is when redemption happens. Jesus shares some breakfast with his disciples because proof of life is in eating. And so Jesus broke bread and he broke fish and he had charcoal fire and he had some breakfast with his disciples. And then when they had finished having breakfast, Simon Peter, Jesus says to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" Now Jesus is going to ask Simon Peter if he loves Jesus more than these, more than the other disciples, more than the world. There's an implication of what this love looks like. He uses different variations of love, agape and philia. But he asks him 3 times. Now, a lot of times when we preach on this text, we get lost in the agape and philia, and Jesus responds when Simon says, yes, I love you. He says, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. And we focus on that, and that's perfectly fine to focus on. But for this moment, I want to focus on the question 3 times. Sometimes we make each other say the same thing over and over again to convince us, right? I love little children or even worse, teenagers, when they're talking with each other and they're negotiating something. And they get to that final negotiation And it's, do you promise? Like, really, do you promise? Like, pinky promise. Do you really promise? And they ask each other over and over again, do you promise? And sometimes I think about that with Jesus. Jesus is asking Peter over and over and over again, 3 times over, do you promise? Do you love me? And we might equate that to our human behavior in which we really need the other person to convince us, not for them, but for us. We need to know that we can trust them. We need to know that we can listen to those words and believe them to be true. But Jesus isn't doing that to Peter. He's not doing this for his sake. See, that's the piece that is so cool in the detail about this text that is just so amazing. Peter, being raised as a Jew, he knew what it was to come before the rabbi, to come before the priest in the temple, especially during the time of Passover. He knew when you brought your offering before the rabbi that you had to convince the rabbi that this was an offering that meant something, that had value, right? Because up until Jesus, all of the offerings in the temple are offerings of atonement. They equal the scales. I've done this wrong, and so I'm going to make this this offering in a way that has value, that equals the scales. It wouldn't equal the scales if you gave someone something that didn't have value to you. That's why when we talk about Lent, right, some people give up things that have great value. For Catholics, it's meat. I honestly still give up meat on Fridays, even though I don't live in an environment where that's kind of the norm. I still love to give up meat on Fridays during Lent. For other people, they give up soda, or they give up chocolate, or they give up the internet, right? Because those are things that have value. They have joy and they hold significance in life. The same was true before the temple priests. When you brought your offering, and for the Passover it was a lamb, right? So if you couldn't afford it, you went with other families. You brought this lamb bound on a stick to the rabbi. And you had to convince the rabbi that this lamb meant something. It wasn't something you had just paid your money for, your shekels for. It was something that actually you had grown to love. In fact, the practice of Jews is that they would get the lambs early in the week on Sunday afternoon, and they lived with their lamb all week long until Thursday or Friday when they had to bring the lamb to the synagogue, to the temple. And so they would, in these closed, tight quarters, the lamb would sleep in the same places that they slept in and would eat near the feet of where they ate. If you can imagine how quickly they grew to love this lamb. And so on the day of preparation, they would bring the lambs to the temple. The families would all gather together, and they'd bring the lamb to the temple. And the rabbi would say, do you love this lamb? And the head of the house would say, yes, I love this lamb. Our family loves this lamb. And the rabbi, if there's any inclination, often they would ask him a second time, do you love this lamb? And the head of the house would say, yes, I love this lamb. We've been living with this lamb. We've fallen in love with this lamb, even though it's been a short time. And finally, the rabbi would ask a third time. Now, you had 3 chances to convince the rabbi that you love this lamb. And historical records, this idea that, can you imagine families and small children all gathered together and kids are crying and yes, we love the lamb. Even worse than small children are the teenagers who just fall in love with everything so quickly, right? They would have been like, yes, I love this lamb. I love this lamb. I love this lamb. Jesus is sitting on the shores of the Sea of Galilee and is redeeming Peter to him. He who would become the cornerstone of the church, the rock for which his church is, appropriately the head of the household in this moment. He's asking Peter, do you love me? He's not asking for himself. He's asking so Peter gets it. You have been restored. Nothing you've done in the past, no mistakes that you've made, no denial that you have given matters anymore. You are restored in me. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? That's what redemption is all about. It's not us trying to convince God, but it's God reminding us over and over again that no matter what our life looks like, there is room for redemption in him. It's a great message. It's a great reminder. God doesn't need us to prove our love for him. God needs us to know that he loves us enough that we don't have to. I hope you have a great Thursday. I hope the rest of the week is going well. See you tomorrow.